So as you all know, and as you can see, today we're going to be talking about regression test automation as it relates to Dynamics 365 finance and supply chain management. Our agenda today, as I mentioned, we will first go through a couple housekeeping items for those of us that are new to this platform or just webinar formats in general. We will do an introduction of your speakers today, or your presenters. We will talk about the what and why behind regression test automation, getting into some details about the different types of use cases, both from a business and an IT side. And lastly, we'll talk about how we at Argano can help your organization. So Jay, just real quick off the bat there, I see you've got a question. Yeah, today's focus is going to be as it relates to D365. That's correct. Hopefully that helps clear some things up off the top of our meeting. So hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, please do chat in another question. And speaking about questions, there is on the housekeeping side, there are a couple things I will mention. On the On24 platform, you've got a couple things that are pretty neat. Obviously, you've got your standard question and answer box. What we're going to do is I'm going to do my best to try to monitor the questions as they come in. And, we'll use some judgment as it relates to whether or not we'll answer them when they come in or hold them off to the end. We will have some time at the end to address questions as well. So if you do have questions, please chat them. We will do our best, and we should get to all of them. And the other thing I'll mention is that there is a closed captioning capability as well. So if you would like to go ahead and turn that on, you get a little transcription that's going to be available. And also the panels that you see on the On24 platform are movable. So you're going to be able to slide, and then move different panels or panes into different locations so you can get focus on different areas. So with that said, that helps it. We're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm Corey Bakhtiari. I'm going to be your MC today. I'm going to help facilitate the conversations as well as tracking the Q&A sort of activities. And along with me, we've got Ina and Josh. Ina and Josh, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Yep, sure. Let me go first. My name is Ina Gorbluk, and I am a quality assurance and test manager at Argano. I've been engaged into quality assurance and testing since 2005, and mainly the majority of that time spent with Microsoft and its ERP. So we kind of grown together, and as soon as I were able to see it from inside out, I had a chance to learn the best practices from Microsoft and apply them in the real world outside here. So now we are growing this practice and applying the best practice to our projects. That's about me. Josh?
All right. Yep. Great. Thank you, Corey and Ina. My name is Josh Lamb. I'm a validation engineer here at Argano Arbella. I've been working with our clients on developing and helping to deliver the validation deliverables with D365. So thank you all for joining, and I hope we have a great discussion today.
Great. Thank you. One of the things we like to go ahead and start with is basically kind of a level setting, a concept introduction around what it is we're talking about. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to have Ina go ahead and kind of give us a little bit of an understanding of the different types of testing. So Ina, why don't you go ahead and take us from here?
Yep. So probably you had to face the testing during your project runs. And that's just a refresher, what types of testing exist and how they should be performed, or which of them should be performed, or kept in mind at least. So the majority of the effort is usually focused on the functional testing, which is really about the application behavior and how the data gets represented, processed, and reported to the user. So that's basically checking the functions of the system. This is the main testing which is being performed. Usually it draws lots of attention, and that's the main part of validation effort. But a part of that, aside of it, there is non-functional testing as well, which is sometimes being forgotten, or which is being checked on the leftover principle, saying that we usually don't have time for non-functional testing. When we say about that, we usually mean security testing, which is about accesses which should be there or should not be there. So that's about roles, security setup in the system, and all those segregation of duties, all those conflicts which might arise if the roles with improper permissions are being assigned and you don't even check it. So that's security, which has been neglected sometimes. The other part is integration testing. It's also part of non-functional in the part of setup. So integration testing, that's about checking that after, when you have deployed your dynamics and you want to integrate with a third-party system, whether it's ADP or whether it's a vendor automated processing or whether it's another CRM system from some other vendor, basically it's a good idea to really test it through, that the data is coming through, that it's going both sides, that the error processing is okay, that the system of tracking the messages is okay. So all that is part of non-functional testing, as well as performance testing. That's another interesting one, because plenty of companies work with pretty significant volumes of data. And when you receive your Microsoft environment, it might be the one that fits you, but when you first estimate the scope of your project and the load at your company, it's like it's not precise, right? You will know for sure later. So it's a good idea to check performance before you actually go live and check it sometimes afterwards. That still this bigger volume of invoices can be sent out, or a bigger volume of pack-and slips can be ingested from EDI system. So all that is part of performance testing, which is also a non-functional testing. And the last one, which is part of non-functional, is installation testing. That's really when we are checking that the package we receive from ISV or the package that we receive from our in-house development team, that all of them work. So again, two types of testing, functional and non-functional. And non-functional contains more like technical things to be checked. And again, functional usually is being looked at pretty precisely, while non-functional is being neglected slightly in majority of the companies. So that's just to keep in mind. And again, when we say about,
Yeah, I guess what I was just going to say is what's interesting is that while we call sometimes the left-hand side, the functional testing, basic, we spend most of the time when actually the non-functional testing, if you think about how much more effort it would to do security, integration, performance, scalability, and usability testing, it even gets less of the overall share, right? Even though if you were to be on the balance, it ought to, if done well, take up a lot more time, right? It's an interesting, it's a very interesting conundrum that oftentimes ends up happening.
Yep. So that was like a refresher before we actually go into the testing details and into test automation and into regression testing, as another approach to testing, right? The other side, because usually when we talk about types of testing, we mean that we have developed something new, right? Or we are implementing something new, and we check this new functionality. That's when we usually do validations, right? That's the core effort, but there is also the other side of it. So Corey, if you can go to the next slide. Why do you need regression testing, right? So regression testing is a different look at it. That's about checking the functionality that has already been with you, has been working well for you, and that it still works okay after the fix got applied, or the feature got turned on, or the SV product got deployed, or any customization deployed. So regression testing is different in terms it's checking not the new functionality. We really don't care much about it, but we do check the one that is already deployed and which has been functioning before. So regression testing is that, in that way, it's different. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And I love that Calvin and Hobbes. You take care of one thing, but you invite a whole bunch of others, right? In this case, flies. So what we're going to go ahead and do is, one of the things we'll just quickly talk about here is the process associated with regression test automation. Now, typically, the way that we would go about this is we would go ahead and deploy a change to a non-production, right, like a development environment. We would do our testing validation against any of the changes associated with that environment. We'll do a build and we'll execute regression tests, and then we'll have business users do their smoke tests typically afterwards. And really, the key point here is that when we talk about regression test automation, basically what we're focusing is on the activity of performing testing to confirm functionality is operating as expected or is as designed, right? And when we look at when we do this, it occurs after changes to software has been introduced. So this includes customizations or extensions. This also includes Microsoft updates, right? This includes system configurations as well, feature enablement. Think about that. These are system changes. And typically, while depending on the specific change, there might be different approaches to how we would go about. In general, if we were to look on it holistically, these would typically, we would want to apply some regression testing components to it. Now, in general, automation is one of these areas, especially with the proliferation of the cloud, where we're going to be able to apply that capability of automation to somewhat repeated or repetitive tasks. These repetitive or repeated tasks are going to be basically testing of core system processes, validating its functioning as expected. Now, what can happen oftentimes when we're doing this manually, so when we have end users actually performing all of the regression testing, is it can be time consuming. It can also therefore be costly, right, to an organization to do that. And sometimes, despite the best intentions, especially considering sometimes it is repeated, it can be error-prone. But the other thing, as Ina mentioned a little bit earlier, one thing to keep in mind here is that when we look at quality assurance in general, like for new feature development, it does not replace that, right? Eventually, perhaps components of quality assurance for new features would then be rolled into a regression testing as a part of subsequent changes to your system. But it does not replace your good old-fashioned QA folks. Okay. Now, one of the things that we mentioned a little bit about is the Microsoft update cadence. So with the proliferation of the SaaS model for business applications, one of the things that suppliers or OEMs of software that are on the cloud need to do is they need to maintain supportability and viability of their products and solutions. And one of the things that they do is they try to maintain what is called a one version approach. So trying to decrease the amount of versions an organization needs to support at any given time. The supplier needs to support at any given time. So in order to accommodate that, Microsoft has a cadence for which they deploy updates and which they force their customers to adopt those updates. So a couple things just to mention. Basically, we're looking at 2 major updates in a given calendar year. And ideally, what we would be looking at as well as a result is 2 regression test cycles as a result of that. 2 core major updates that Microsoft will be applying. Now, what we're going to go ahead and do is let's talk a little bit more about some different use cases. When the different forms of regression testing come up, who actually sometimes ends up performing it, and what are some of the challenges, the goals associated with that? And what we'll go ahead and do is I'll hand this back over to you, Ina.
Yep. Okay, so those are the common cases that we have observed in multiple companies. That's really the common case. So why would accountants validate? Basically, they have their own daily routine. They have their end month close. They have their payments. They have their charts. They have no time to work on validation. Moreover, it's repetitive. So it's not once, just done with it and forget about it. Basically, when they have been hired, it was not on their job list for sure to go and validate the system. And on the other hand, that's their tool of work, and you wouldn't expect to validate your tool on a frequent basis. You would expect it just to work. That's why many people who are professionals in their areas, they feel a little bit reluctant about going and validating the application they work with. It's quite understandable, and it's okay, and everyone can get it. So from this perspective, each employee who have their own task, whether it's a warehouse work user, right, who basically doesn't care much about mobile web application, right, or accountant working with Dynamics, or someone working with AP, they really want to see the seamless work of the application, and they don't see it necessary to go and to do some additional work, just check it that the system still works for them after something has happened, where they are usually not sure what actually has happened. So that's the first part of the puzzle. Let's go further. The other part of it is that the day has 8 hours in it, right? And there are people usually have full hands of tasks. They're swamped with work right now, and they don't have time for validation, really. So each upgrade for them is, and those requests come from the IT team to go validate something, to provide feedback, it's something on top of it, and it's something which doesn't probably fit into their business schedule, so into their business hours. So whatever they can say, that they can do manual validation during their business hours, which means that they will be stealing time from their actual daily chores, right, from their routine, which is probably not an option. And so basically this validation would distract them from their activities, which is also not the best thing to happen. So that's the second part of this puzzle. Going further, that's the person who usually suffers. So the one who usually has a huge headache over each of the Microsoft upgrades, updates, deployments, new features, and everything. Because the IT person usually, there is usually a person responsible for the system in the company, right? And that person is responsible to have it up to date, to have it configured correctly, and everything should be perfect. But they are limited. In terms of validation, they are usually limited on willingness and availability of the business users. So even if there is an upgrade coming from Microsoft, right, those 2 weeks time frame, and it will be applied by, you cannot avoid it by no means, you have no choice. If your business users are not ready for it, they have their own end month closing, no way they will be able to do this. So that's where IT administrator becomes responsible for something he cannot or that they cannot actually control, which is not the best case scenario. So that's another tiny part of this puzzle, which is also quite a heavy one. Then, as a sequence of this, right, your business users say they're not available. You have to upgrade anyway because Microsoft has the mandatory upgrade coming, that one of 2 which are mandatory, right, major updates. You cannot skip it, so what are you going to do? You will upgrade, right? I mean, it's not you can prohibit it, so it will be applied. And that's the moment when this change comes in, when something gets deployed without preliminary validation, or it might be slightly validated by users who had some feedback. Again, not thoroughly, whatever they could, they did, right? And then just let's deploy it. The thing is that on Monday morning, after the update deployment or custom code deployment or whatever, which usually happens over a weekend, on Monday morning, some of the business users can reach out saying, hey, I'm working with AP processing and I cannot interact with my bank anymore. What has happened? And what it means for the company, right? That's a risk that something will get impacted. And that's a heavy risk in terms of cost. Because if you're not delivering up to your promises, then there might be quite penalties behind it. That might be a reduction of revenue. If something has not been produced on time, delivered on time, then probably you will lose it forever. And also, it's also reputational risk, because it's bad for your business users on one hand, who do not trust the system anymore, because it should have helped them to perform the daily task how they have been taught to, and now they cannot do anything. And also, it's about customers who don't get their their piece of interaction from the company, so they also can claim that the company does not meet the expectations. So that's a huge impact, and that impact can be evaluated in terms of dollars, which is really a number. So that's basically the part of risk management, right? How you can evaluate that if you do not validate something, what might have happened. Again, the change can be anywhere, so no one can guarantee that in some very, very far area, seemingly unrelated to the change applied, something has not got broken on the Monday morning. So without validation, it's really risky. Let's go to the last one. Okay, you have deployed. Probably everything worked. Nothing got broken, luckily. So checks are still being sent out. Data management works. Integrations are still there. You can send your data to the banks. But your users, your poor business users, who usually are very cautious about any of the systems, you can imagine how they feel if there was a change in the application behavior. So if there was any tiny change they have not been informed about, right? If the system tells them that there is a new view they should be using, or a new grid, or a new button, or anything, you can imagine how surprised they get and how frustrated they get. They cannot rely onto the system anymore, and that's a risk. Because as soon as they do not stop trusting the system, they will try to avoid using it by all means. They will try to get back to Excel, to send in Word documents, to the Outlook email, to paperwork, everything, but just to avoid this unreliable system. And that's the moment when this, the overall implementation project, it stops paying off in full. So there was quite an effort and cost behind the implementation, and now business users who do not trust that much anymore, they stop using the system to the full, and they try to avoid it by all means, which usually means that the processes will not be efficient, and it might impact other business users who are dependent on this process. So that's why when there is a change in the system which has not been communicated or noted by the IT team and have not been communicated in advance to the business users, there is a risk that the cost of such change to the company might be pretty high. Okay. So you might, after hearing all previous stuff, you might think, okay, business users are not available, they have their tasks, probably they should not validate. No, that's not the case. If they can do at least something, if they can validate at least the results of your validation, of your automated validation, if they can smoke test, they should do this just to confirm that it's still okay for them. Because even if it's automated testing, when the system did everything for you, delivered the results, the business user should at least look through those results and confirm that it's still okay for them. That if the system has posted the journals for them, that the journals look okay, vouchers are okay, and accounts are still, as they would expect them to be. And the other part of it is that if IT team is prepared ahead of time, right? First, if there were major issues to business processes, you would learn about them from, for example, automated tests before end users see them, which means that end users will not be disturbed that much. So major issues can be communicated back to Microsoft, for example, or to the partner, saying that they need to get resolved before it hits your production. And if there were application changes in the process and your, for example, automated test failed because there was a change and now the button is not there anymore, or the button has changed to be 2 buttons, you need to click one to see the other one, you will be able to see this list in advance, and this list can be communicated to business users saying, hey, there was a change here. It's nothing drastic to your process. Just get prepared that you will be clicking 2 buttons here, or vice versa. You had 2 buttons, now it's 1. Or you have a new view here, and you can save your view as favorite. Probably the system will be talking to you, saying that you can save it. Don't get scared. So if this communication happens in advance, it's really accepted much easier, and the level of trust and reliability is still there. So that's our, preconditions and use cases which we usually see in majority of the companies who are working with IT tools. And again, each company is becoming digital a lot, right? Especially with those COVID limitations and other unpredictable events, right? Majority of these companies deploy different ERP systems, CRM systems, and everything. And we need somehow to be sure that those systems perform in the way they should. But usually companies do not have a special QA department to sit there and validate each time that it's still okay for the company to use the system.
So yep. We talked about the business users and the IT team and their challenges. What about like the role of like a business analyst? How, or if they get involved, sometimes I don't know what their level of expertise is, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, usually the business analyst is usually the person, that person in the company who knows the processes, at least how the system should behave. But they cannot, usually business analyst cannot speak instead of business users. So the final word about the process will be said by business users to confirm, but business analyst knows everything, and usually they don't have that much time to go and evaluate every area. So they cannot go to AP and finance and warehouse management and inventory management to check that it's still okay there. But they are aware that those areas are being used and should be validated.
Right. So they've got some broad scope, but they may not have the level of detail knowledge in order to perform this. And again, like with the other roles we were talking about, they've probably got other things they need to do as well. Right? There's just not a ton of time for them to perform these activities.
Yeah.
It seems to be a common trend.
Yep.
Cool.
So those are
Great.
the challenges.
Thank you, Ina. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and hand this off now to Josh. Joshua, take us away.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Ina. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the highly regulated industries and kind of how the validation plays into the industries and how regression testing supports the validation in the regulated industries. So we're talking life science, aerospace, military, police, government, contractor organizations, and so forth. The highly regulated industries are obligated to perform validation regularly due to statutory customer industry requirements. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the GAMP manual. So the GAMP is Good Automated Manufacturing Practice, and it's generated by ISPE and a lot of pharma companies that I've been at. They've really looked to this Good Automated Manufacturing Practice manual, and the methodology is kind of their baseline for how they're going to conduct their validation. So the bullet points below here on this slide, the most ones I want to talk about are the bottom two here that provides the guidance on the validation of the software and the guidance on efficient testing practices, and we'll see how kind of the regression testing kind of supports efficient testing practices as well. So on the right here is a little more about GAMP. It's a risk-based approach to compliant GXP computerized systems. It provides a framework for the risk-based approach to computer system validation, where a system is evaluated and assigned a predefined category based on its intended use and complexity. So when we look at software as a system or a SaaS model, those are category 4 identified per the GAMP manual and the methodology. So on the left, if you see where we have the requirements and the specifications going down, you see category 4 is affected a lot here for things like functional specifications, configuration specs, design specs. And then when you go towards the right is where we'll see kind of regression test automation implementing the life cycle more. And specifically, we're looking more towards this functional testing where the OQ is and the requirements testing where the PQ is. We generally don't use the regression testing for the IQ because the IQ is more importing your code, importing your configurations, your security, and that's most of the time done by a system administrator. So we're looking more on the OQ and the PQ side to help leverage the regression test automation. And so as per the Gantt manual, it suggests to do a proactive risk assessment and validation plan, and that'll kind of help you determine your strategy for your validation, generate your specifications and your qualification documents. So as mentioned earlier, we have the IQ, the OQ, and the PQ, and you can see in this figure to the right, we have on the right side the IQ, OQ, PQ being kind of the final deliverables in the testing cycle. We're looking more on the OQ and PQ for the regression testing here. Yep, thank you. So RTA, regression test automation here on the OQ and PQ. And this kind of alleviates, as Ina mentioned earlier, you have business users in the PQ testing the process. And so if you have, say, an update to D365 and you want to make sure that your things like workflows, those haven't changed or things like that, you can generate those test cases in an automated fashion where you can alleviate the time from the business user and have the software run it by itself using the set of security or whatever it may be, how you have it configured for the user, so you don't have to have 6, 7 people in a room to do the testing. So that's a high point of using the regression testing, is that you can develop these test cases for future use, and you can sort of reschedule the time of your other business users so they can work on their quote-unquote day jobs. Another thing I wanted to point out here is we have 2 figures on the very right here. And to the right of those 2 figures is the computer system validation model. And this is where I've seen in a couple pharma companies where they're still using this model, where the top pillar here is the main focus, and that's on documentation. And they'll generate documentation stacks that are 3 feet high, and they kind of take the more conservative approach, and they kind of tell themselves, when an auditor comes, we'll give them all the documentation we have, and we know that we've tested everything because we've thought of every scenario and so forth. And so that's kind of seen as the old style, and I'm going to use that in quotes, because then we go to this computer software assurance model, which is on the left, and this is not out yet from the FDA, but the FDA has this on its A list of guidances and documents to get out in 2022. So there's a major difference from the right figure to the left figure in the sense that it's putting more of an emphasis on the critical thinking and the software assurance side, but the testing is still a good portion of your validation and your assurance. So with regression test automation, you can still have that big portion of their testing, but you can use it in sort of a critical way where you can say, okay, we've tested this before. How can we retailor this test case and keep our management in a lean fashion while still, allowing the business users who may have had to come in and do this manually? How can we kind of use that in an automated testing software to do our retests when we have things such as code updates, or if there's configuration updates and things like that. So the bottom 2 bullet points here, it also reduces the need for additional documentation. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have a test case that was previously executed by a business process owner or someone who would be executing a certain workflow or things like that, you can determine in the software an account you can give specifically to do that. So it can be managed by much less people, and you can create your protocols so that you don't have as many test cases and you don't require as many personnel and resources. And furthermore, for the efficient test management is you'll have less test cases overall because you'll be able to reuse the ones that you already have, repurpose some with some minor changes if you have software configuration updates, and it'll be easy to manage all in one central location.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, and that leads us very much well into our next section. How can Argano help? And that is around being able to implement efficient testing practices, right? Specifically around managing the cost and the risk of not performing regression testing. Basically, as was mentioned by Josh and was also in a couple ways with the use cases from Ina, testing oftentimes can be an afterthought, and it's frankly a time-consuming exercise. And this is where an organization, frankly, if starting soon, is going to be able to reap a lot of benefits. And this is actually an excerpt, if I'm not mistaken, Josh, from the GAMP manual as well. And this is where I think we can definitely help bring some extra capabilities to all of our customer and prospects organizations. So basically, at a high level, what is it that we can do at Argano? Is we provide services and intellectual property to facilitate and implement, the implementation and support of regression test automation. So as we've heard today, we have some real deep subject matter expertise, both with Josh and Ina. And we have a dedicated both validation and quality assurance team with knowledge of not just business processes, so think about peer-to-pay expenditure, as well as your receiving, et cetera, business cycles, but also of the testing processes, the level of detail that needs to go into the different types of testing, as well as the technology, both the technology in which these processes rely upon, as well as the technology that actually performs the test automation itself. Because when we talk about automation, we're not talking about Josh and Ina actually going and doing the testing. We've got tooling to support that. We've got a series of standard operating procedures as well as templates. One template I will highlight, if you look onto our right on this slide, is the team has gone ahead and built a series of test cases. Test cases, we're talking Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain, that are generated from task reports, that are built into test cases in Azure DevOps, that cover standard functionality, that are effectively what you might consider to be accelerators, that are places for your organization to start the regression test automation exercise. You're going to be able to get access to this set of test cases and be able to apply them to your specific environment. This is only a subset of what are many, many hundreds of different test cases covering core business processes. And of course, customizations, any type of nuances, we'll take a look at as well. And the technology we're really looking at as it relates to this, as we often like to talk about people, process, and technology, as I mentioned, core on the platform of finance and supply chain, leveraging lifecycle services for business processing, business processes, Azure DevOps for test cases, but more specifically, want to highlight Regression Suite Automation Tool. RSAT is its acronym. That is the tooling that we use, that the team uses to go ahead and perform the test automation. It's just a point of nuance here. One thing that we do is we provide regression test automation services, and implementation and support services, and we mainly use a tool called RSAT, which is a Microsoft developed and supported and provided tool. Where we come in is we provide a set of test cases that are pre-configured, as well as a level of expertise that know both the tooling and the processes behind actually implementing and executing, as well as supporting regression test automation. One thing that's pretty interesting here, and I'll show you some of the math behind this, is what are we looking at from a return on investment as it relates to implementing something like test automation? As you might expect, sometimes, like in many things, there is an initial cost associated with implementing something. It's any type of tooling. And we've ran the numbers and we've actually proven this out. What we are looking at, if you were to go ahead and engage with regression test automation services, we're looking at around 4 regression test cycles, so 4 runs of regression testing on the automated plan in order for you to take and receive a return on that initial investment of setting it up. And we'll talk about how we get to that number. But basically, at this level, what we want to make sure that we communicate is that the sooner that you start on this, the sooner you can start managing and reaping the benefits of cost reduction. And of course, all of those other things that were mentioned around maintaining validation compliance, ensuring user adoption and user confidence in the system is high, allowing and enabling your business users and IT folks to go ahead and do other high value activities versus some of the more repetitive things. All these things would be factored in as gravy or as a bonus on top of the raw cost calculation. And the raw cost calculation is kind of coming from this side of things. So basically what we're looking at, remember when we're talking about implementing this, we're talking about creating test cases and then automating those test cases. So in order to, what we were looking at is we've estimated approximately based on an example you saw in a couple slides, previous slides, is it takes around 2 hours, let's say, to create each test case, right? That's both leveraging your task recorder, building that into a test case and an ADO, and then it takes about another 2 hours to automate that test case. Then from an ongoing perspective, right? If we were to separate how you would actually be performing manual regression test efforts, so having individual users go through and do it themselves, versus automated tests, we're looking at around a half an hour per test case to run on a manual basis, versus once we've set up those test cases to be automated, a 2 hour setup to run all automated test cases in that cycle. And we've also factored in the fact that, hey, you know what, not everything works well, right? Sometimes we get some failures. Sometimes you need to fix, obviously you would need to resolve those failures. You need to figure out either, hey, is this something we need to go look at the system around? Is this something that otherwise we need to examine? And so we've incorporated some factors around managing where things don't go swimmingly. But what we're gonna see at the end of the day is that 2 hour to set up and execute, so that second line, all of the automated test cases in this cycle, as well as the 1 hour to fix failed test cases for 20% of cases, first one being negligible, the last two being somewhat canceled each other out, right? What we're looking at here is that for the 2 hours to automate each test case, and the half an hour to execute per test case manually, we divide those, and what we're looking at is around 4, right? So it would take you 4 test cycles once you've moved to an automated regression test approach to actually begin to take and get a return on the benefit, a return on the investment, because you would have by then had taken 2 hours to perform that manual regression test activity, right? So basically what we would be looking at is 4 cycles, because it would take you 4 times as long to do the automation factor of a regression test build. And one of the things that I really think is pretty significant about this is that what you're going to see is that if we're only talking about Microsoft major updates, we're talking 2 years. In 2 years, you're going to be able to get a return on investment. And the other thing that I'll mention is that this is regardless of how many test cases you have, right? So because you will be testing these anyway, right? Most likely the test cases, what you end up finding is that it takes you half an hour to run that manual test versus it takes you 2 hours to set up the automation. Doesn't matter how many test cases you've got, it's going to take you 4 cycles to get that return on investment. And then everything after that, including all of those maybe hard to attribute components like improved user adoption, getting your IT and business users to focus on other high value activities, are really going to be that extra bonus or gravy on top of your adoption of regression test automation. Okay, So just a couple points here. As we mentioned, what we're going to do, what regression test automation, what we've been talking about is primarily as it relates to D365 finance and supply chain management. And this really is going to impact your business users and your IT group, right? We're going to be able to reduce costs in the long term by decreasing the need for user testing. We're also going to be able to reduce the risk or the issue or reduce the maybe potential result of penalties for non-compliance, for example, for validation processes. This is going to also allow you to proactively prepare for changes. Being more proactive about changes and communicating that to your end users is going to help provide additional confidence for them in order to better adopt or better to facilitate the adoption of a system. Less surprises, right, at the end of the day. Also, it's going to reduce downtime. Everybody wants to reduce downtime. Nobody likes to do it. One of the points of having an ERP, one of the points of having a business application is to enable business processes, to enable business operations to be more efficient. And this is what key point in order to enable that. And as was mentioned, really a key component of both validation and compliance as well, and some other attributes you can see down there as well. So what we covered was we went ahead and we reviewed a little concept of testing. What are the different types of testing? We went through a what and why of the regression testing and automation. We saw some common use cases associated with the roles impacted, as well as the different types of application of test automation, for example, with validation processes, you guys just mentioned around with Josh. We looked at a quick view of our Argano's implementation offering and some analysis on a return on investment, as well as some specifics around the benefits associated with regression test automation. So with that, I believe what I will ask is, are there any questions? I know we've got around 12 minutes. I got a couple questions here, but again, please feel free to chat in your questions into the Q&A box or panel on 24, and we will answer them. I have a couple questions already. Jay, I think we were good on the one that you had asked, but one of the questions we see here is, how do the pre-configured test cases apply to different clients? How can a client take advantage of these test cases, and are they applied differently per client? Ina, maybe you want to take that one?
Yep, sure. So the predefined set of test cases is getting applied to your DevOps, to your environment. The data gets updated to use your data, your customer vendor IDs, your journals, and everything. And part of the tests, which are standard ones, will likely pass on that stage, but some of them, which have to deal with dimensions or workflows or specific settings for approvals, might fail. And in that case, we would have to review the recording itself. So when we review the recording, we can either edit it. If it's kind of small change, add in a couple more steps and it will pass. We need to click submit button and the journal will be submitted. Or sometimes we'll have to correct the test case and write the one that will fit the business process of that particular client. But again, the standard ones should work out of the box. It's just changing the IDs in them. So that's how we address this.
Thank you. And then another one is, how do we handle test cases that incorporate things like integrations or reports?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one, right? So Microsoft has a roadmap where they claim that by the end of September, we'll have the ability, we'll get the ability to create, from RSAT, we'll be able to create test cases for integrations and for SSRS reports. Basically, those were the two main areas which haven't been covered before. So waiting for the next release for RSAT from Microsoft, coming this end of September, if everything goes as planned.
All right, thank you. Got another one. So from Stephen, does RSAT handle custom entities? I think customizations as well. Maybe Stephen, when you say custom entities, we're talking about like custom tables or like the data migration framework, or maybe if you know what.
Yeah, so I believe, so if you mean any customizations, RSAT works with them. So whatever is in Dynamics, any form control, which is basically not Dynamics, the only limitation, if you have some dynamic control, it just appears here dynamically, it doesn't have even the ID, there RSAT might have an issue. But overall, any customization inside of Dynamics, inside of the application works well. So it will grab this form, grab this functionality, click that particular button of yours, and would process through your process. So it allows to record those things and automate them.
Okay, I hope Steve, that helped answer your question. If it didn't, please feel free to chat something else. I do want to also mention that, hey, you know what, if this is something that you're interested in at least having conversations about, I highly recommend that you go ahead and reach out to your account manager that would be like associated with your specific organization. If you're not sure who that person is, please do send an email to connect@arbellatech.com, and we will make sure that we get you in touch with the right person to help facilitate those conversations. And it seems like we did answer that question for Stephen. So thank you, everybody. I think, so then, Josh, maybe I've got a quick question for you as well on the validation side. Have you seen, like, from, your usage of test automation, are there any issues with compliance or any type of regulatory or statutory challenges associated with using, test automation? Are there any other nuances or complications associated with that maybe we should be examining? Any other thoughts on that point?
So for our most recent client that we're working with, we just mentioned that in our validation plan that we're going to be using the RSAT tool to assist in the execution. And it might be a discussion with each client's quality team to determine their comfortability with that, assessment and how they want to handle the justification of saying, yep, we're going to bring in a RSAT tool to help us do our testing. And this is our justification and comfortability level with giving the go-ahead of using it. And if there's extra considerations, you can discuss internally with the client-specific quality team. But with our past client that we're working with right now, we haven't seen any very major issues.
Can I add 5 cents here?
Yeah.
So basically, why test automation might be the silver bullet, probably a little bit of it, for the compliant companies. The thing is that automated tests, as soon as they are created, right, the results of the execution cannot be modified. So no one can come in and correct anything. It logs each time which data has been used, each value, how it clicked the button, which button has been clicked. Also, RSAT allows to make screenshots during its run to confirm how it has been going through the steps. It means that there will be some auditable, reliable results, which are reliable in terms of no fraud is possible. So, and they are traced there in the system without ability to edit. That's it. So that's why for audit purposes, the results of those tests are quite reliable. And the history of the runs is being saved, so you can, each validation cycle will be saved in the same single place, can be exported at any time. So whoever is interested in the previous run, previous validation, which has been done a year ago, they can export the results of this year ago run and provide them for auditing purposes, you see? So that's a little bit of, it resembles this PDF approach when you cannot edit. As soon as you have signed, then it's done. That's why it covers for this. That's why test automation might be quite a good option to be considered for the companies who need to get the validations audited.
Thank you. And I think, like with many things, the folks that might be in QA or in auditing, I know some for, it's also a progression. It's also a getting of confidence and understanding of how some things work as well. It's not, the first time they're going to run it, they're going to have questions, but then that extra knowledge, conditioning, and then the ability to accept the results and poke around, play with it, confirm details and things like that, where you can't manipulate or change the results. Proving that out, like almost validating the validation tool, is also going to be kind of important as well. That's great. If there's anything else on the QA I do not see, or anything else from Josh or Ina, what we'll go ahead and do is we'll wrap up our webinar today on regression test automation. As I mentioned previously, it would be great if you go ahead and just to have a conversation, reach out to your account manager or send an email to see if and or how we can implement regression test automation at your organization. So thank you all. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Ina, and thank you, Josh.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.